Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that's going to save Christmas. And how are you, Rob?
I'm very well, thank you, Tom. How are you?
Oh, yeah, I'm not bad. I would normally spend a little bit of time here talking about myself, I guess, but I think it's probably more prudent this week that we introduce our guest. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everybody. Hello. Hello from Germany. I'm Lucas. Now I have to come up with a introduction about myself. I'm Lucas. I recently made a video about German political parties on the YouTubes, and that one went kind of off the rails. And I guess people saw it, and now I'm here to talk about exactly that.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about how we would like one of our listeners to come and join us. I knew we had some German listeners. You were in my mind. And then you published an excellent video, which will be in the show notes, about the German political parties.
Which was, of course, the plan all along.
It was a cunning plan to get on the podcast, but we're glad you're here. Before we dive into German politics, we are going to do our usual headlines because there's been a lot to talk about since it's slightly over 2 weeks since we last did an episode. Our first set of headlines, from the Mirror, shambles, and from the Independent, Army called up to tackle UK's fuel crisis. What can you tell me about that, Rob?
So this is the news that Britain has been going through a little bit of a fuel shortage, or have we? Because the government has been very adamant that there is no fuel shortage, and they're kind of right, but in so saying that, it's a bit like when the chairman of a football club says that they have utmost faith in the manager. You know, as soon as they say that, they're going to sack the manager. So the moment that our Prime Minister says you don't need to panic buy fuel, people are going to go out and panic buy fuel, which has been the case for a couple of weeks now. I believe it's starting to calm a little bit down. But essentially what sparked this all off is an HGV lorry driver shortage. We touched on that in the podcast last time, that was causing delays to, shipping and stocking supermarkets. It's also been a knock-on effect for BP, who said that they would have to close a couple of their petrol stations because they didn't have the HGV drivers to drive the fuel to the station. It was only BP that was affected, but as soon as this news got out and word that there might be a bit of a fuel crisis, people started to go out and top up their cars. This led to massive queues at the petrol station, and in so doing, it caused a crisis where people suddenly realised they couldn't fill up their cars because everybody else was trying to do it. I saw some explanations that said if everybody in the country decided to top their car up from halfway full to full, we'd need like an extra 1 billion gallons of petrol just to keep up with that demand. And that all we were seeing over this 2-week period was a massive increase in demand that the fuel pump stations were never being able to go to supply, but they were running dry entirely. So this is why you have headlines like shambles and headlines like the army is going to be brought in. It appears that the army are going to be brought in to do every task at the moment, including driving fuel to destinations to keep up that supply to make sure those BP stations didn't close. But as I said, it has started to calm down, as, at least in the north I heard, and in the south it's been, it's starting to calm down as well. I must say that I was unaffected, and maybe it's one of these things where this whole other situation that's going on, I won't mention the C word, but because that had me working from home for the past 2 weeks, in another life, I would have been very concerned about the petrol status of my car. These past 2 weeks, I've hardly gone anywhere because I work from home, so I've just sort of kept my car at home and kept it out of the garages, and fingers crossed this will all blow over. But that's one of the many issues that's facing our country at the moment.
A lot of people were asking me, people who aren't living in the UK, what's it like having this situation over there at the moment? I think the problem is there's a lot of hyperbole out and about all over the place. But it's definitely one of those things where, everyone's like, oh, well, I need to top up a small amount of fuel. And as you say, if suddenly everyone decides they need to 10 pounds of fuel at the same time, that's the problem. And it's suddenly you run out. But we definitely had issues here. I thought, it'll be over in a few days. I was like, it'll be like the toilet roll thing. Everything, the supply lines will readjust, but there were still queues around the corner. I mean, if you wanted to spend several hours trying to get fuel, it was possible. I don't think, if you had to get fuel, it was possible, but you would be in a long queue and you'd be wasting fuel in the process. And I know a few people who went around to look for fuel, which was not essential. And then they said, well, I ran out of fuel looking for fuel, so I ended up having to get the train or something to something they were doing later in the week. Last night, which is over a week and a half, maybe 2 weeks later, I drove past the petrol station and the queues were slightly longer than normal, but not unreasonable. Just it seems like people, I think they might still be rationing the amount of fuel you can buy at certain pumps, because I've seen a lot of posts on social media about that, where it's like you can only fill up £30 worth or X number of litres, and that depends on the petrol station. So yeah, that's been fun. I fortunately didn't have to drive anywhere myself. I had arranged to get a lift with someone who was able to get fuel to an event, but I am fortunate in that, as you say, I work from home most of the time, and when I'm not working from home, I get the train into London, so that was all fine. But I think it's kind of it's shown up various issues like you mentioned. This is kind of, it harks back to all that kind of stuff where people were talking about Brexit and the knock-on effects it would have. And I think it shows a lack of trust in the government, essentially. People are like, the government has said that there is enough fuel. I saw a few references back to Theresa May's "there will be adequate food" comments. So yeah, it's been not a great week really, and it kind of doesn't fill you with confidence going forwards if every time the government says, oh yeah, this will definitely be fine, everyone goes out and panic buys. It's not great. So in The Guardian, prepare for a winter of discontent, and in the Daily Mail, Britain faces winter of woe. What's that about, Rob?
So we've seen the short-term problems of fuel crisis here at petrol pumps, which the government have assured us will be sorted out. And we were talking about them before, the shortage of HGV drivers. We had that in the episode before when we were talking about the other knock-on effects that may have of supply chains and getting things to supermarkets, etc. It appears that we're also short of labourers in many other key sections of the economy. Agriculture is one of them. And farming is another. There is a story that broke today of they're going to have to basically slaughter pigs but not process them through the meat processing factory because they don't have the staff to do that. So these pigs will just die, depending on your views on meating or not, they die needlessly anyway, but that's particularly needless if they're not even going to be used for food afterwards. So there are worries that there will be shortages of food around Christmas time. There was a news story that broke that said that British favourite pigs in blankets will not be available at Christmas, which prompted some people, at least at my work, to panic buy pigs and blankets frozen and put them in their freezers ready for Christmas. So you've got those potential things on the horizon. You've got general supply chain issues that are not exclusive to Great Britain. There is a worldwide supply chain crisis at the moment that kind of even harks back to when the Evergreen ship got stuck in the canal. That caused a bit more chaos and delay to our shipping lanes than we thought, and is still having knock-on effects. And clearly, COVID and the pandemic situation has had an impact on productivity and the way that you can transport things. I think even in America, they are warning people of delays and trying to make sure people buy early for Christmas if they want to get the presents that they want, because deliveries at the moment are under so much strain that they probably can't put up with the even bigger strain they have usually when it gets to winter. So that's another problem that we're facing. So you've got that food crisis, supply chain crisis. You've also got an energy crisis as prices are starting to go up. We saw a number of energy companies go out of business all of a sudden because there's quite a large energy market in the UK. Some of them who are running very competitive prices, selling their energy as cheap as possible, went bankrupt the moment that prices went up, which means a lot of people are being forced to change to a different but more expensive supplier to get through the winter. That could have a big impact on people's budgets. Put on top of that, you've got increased inflation. If you've got these supply chain crises, you've got these food crises, then it's likely that the cost of fuel and food will go up. That will squeeze people's budgets even more. So they might be in for a very tight Christmas when you're talking about money-wise. When people mention the winter of discontent, that was a stage when in Britain's history where we had to sort of go down to a 3-day working week because there wasn't enough power to run the country for the traditional 5-day working week. So the government had to step in and say, no, we'll limit the amount of energy we use and we'll only work for 3 days. There have even been some rumblings that could happen over the winter as you get that massive, strain on society and, people not being able to afford, big businesses not being able to afford the rise in fuel prices. That's exacerbating a lot of things that they're trying to do at the moment. So, yeah, if you thought the fuel crisis was bad, if you thought the shortage of HGV drivers was bad, it might be one of a number of things that is building up to a tricky winter period for the UK, and certainly a very challenging time for the government. How they get through that and how they manage that, we're yet to see. But the papers at least have highlighted it to us, and I think it's something to watch out for as we get into November, December time, certainly.
And continuing this kind of theme of, do people trust the government to supply things? I know that's a question that gets asked Actually, it's been asked in a lot of COVID questionnaires that I've had to fill out where they're like, how do you feel the government is tackling this? How do you feel we, the institution, are tackling this kind of thing? And I've also noticed popping up in like YouGov surveys where they're like, do you think the government can, provide for everyone essentially? You know what I mean? Not that the government is buying you things specifically, but ensure that supply lines are kept open. And I think people basically don't trust them at the moment, as seen by the fuel crisis. And I have seen, again, this is anecdotal, but I've seen someone saying that their wife went and panic bought a plastic Christmas tree so that they would definitely have a Christmas tree for Christmas. I think that might be very much an overreaction at this point,
Yes.
But I think planning ahead a bit more than you might do for Christmas might be prudent. I think, I'm not saying buy different things. I'm just saying that the postal service is going to be very overwhelmed in the run up to Christmas, I think, specifically. So if you want to send presents out and stuff a bit earlier, it might help spread the load on services like that. As for the fuel thing, I think the other thing to note is how many we've had a lot of very small kind of startup is the wrong word, but a lot of new energy companies. And a lot of them have closed down. I can't remember how many there were in a week. I think there was 6 at one point in 1 week.
Mm-hmm. Yes, there was a lot, wasn't there, in 1 week? And I think today I noticed that energy prices have jumped again. So that might yet force more companies to close. I don't know how close those other ones are to the line of like profit margins or whatever. But yeah, it is worrying.
Yeah, and I think it depends because we got a letter, and this has been reported. I'll put the BBC News article in there, but we're with Bulb. Who are one of, I think, the bigger 6 now. I mean, they're quite new, but they're doing very well for themselves, or at least we thought. And they sent out a message to something like 80% of their customers saying, we're going to charge you more because they can't do that. You're on a fixed rate, but saying, to prepare for the winter ahead, we would like you to increase your monthly payments. But the thing is, they're asking people to increase their monthly payments by like often more than they were quoted for their entire bill originally. And it must be to kind of offset the fact that the costs are going to change, and then it gets some money into the bank for them. But obviously, customers don't want to suddenly pay a lot more. So we'll see what happens with that. I know there were rumours about it going under, but they've stressed that's not happening. But it sounds like they might be being bought out by one of the other energy companies. So I think there's going to be a lot of conglomeration in that market in the near future. Not quite back to the days of just British Gas, but I think we could see it very like there's something like 60 or 70 of them at the moment, and with all of these closing down, and basically you have to have energy, so you just get transferred to another one by Ofgem. So we're going to suddenly be in a situation where maybe you're picking between like 2 or 3 energy companies, and the competition in the market will just drop out.
And I think I'd just like to add to that, like a lot of these are market problems, but I would say that the way that our government has reacted to them is a little bit worrying. So like the government can't control energy prices, like that is the free market in action, but it should be ready to step in if a crisis comes along. And a lot of the time the government has said, hey, business will sort this out. And business has looked back to the government and said, no, actually, you need to help us out. You need to fund us to get through this crisis. It's your problem for not having that. I think one of the big problems that our energy has gone up so much is that British Gas sold some of its reserves earlier on, like a couple of years ago, that made the company a very big short-term profit, but left us vulnerable in a situation like that. That we were having now. So that makes it the situation in Britain even worse than it is for like the rest of Europe. On top of that, you have the government saying that it's going to raise taxes. We talked about them raising national insurance. That will have a big squeeze on people on lower incomes. They are also about to take away the extra £20 universal credit, which a lot of people have relied on like over this very tough COVID period. To take that away now when inflation is going up is even more worrying. And I know the furlough scheme was meant to come to an end at the end of September. I know Rishi Sunak has extended that for some jobs and kept it going. So the government is still supporting some parts of the economy. But Boris Johnson's party conference speech that he did the other day was rather, he supports a hands-off approach of the government and, hey, let the hand of business do its thing. Business is the one looking to government and say, you need to support us, mate, because if you don't, we'll see collapses in fundamental things. The one that comes to mind and the one where the actual government has had to step in was CO2 production. I think that might have been linked to energy prices, but essentially fertilizer wasn't being made, and a byproduct of the fertilizer process is CO2, which doesn't just go in your fizzy drinks, but is also there to help preserve your meat that goes on the shelves. Whenever you get those packages, they are filled with CO2, which helps preserve the shelf life of things. And if the government didn't step in to help keep that CO2 production going, then they might have seen far more empty shelves than we're seeing now, because the free market couldn't maintain that thing. So the government said, okay, no more empty supermarket shelves. We will help you guys run for a month, and hopefully things would have sorted out by then. But I will be interested to see how long the government is willing to fund things like that, and if Boris Johnson has to get a lot more hands-on with the economy that he'd like, or if he's still going to keep this ideological stance of no, things will sort out. The energy companies are closing down, but that's fine. That's the free market in action. We want the ones that can survive. They're the ones making a profit. That's how you survive in the long term. And really, I'm like, well, no, those smaller companies were providing a very valuable service to people living, close to the edge when it comes to their own funds and how they can support things, and going through a winter where you need energy the most, you need that fuel to warm your house through the winter. That's going to be an issue. So a lot of challenges for Boris Johnson up ahead, and my view on Boris Johnson probably hasn't been muted on this podcast before, but I'm not confident that he is up to the challenge. But let's see, shall we? The
government is like a duck, serene on the top maybe, but frantically paddling underneath.
Yes.
And hopefully, I hope it stays that way, where things don't get worse. But I as I say, we've been talking about lack of confidence in the government. My confidence is not high right now. I think maybe now would be a time to move on to the main topic of the episode and get away from some rather depressing headlines in the UK and talk about something that is interesting to us, and therefore, I suppose, a slight distraction. As we mentioned earlier, we're going to be talking about the German election that has just happened. Well, I think we're going to get into why it's not necessarily a done deal for a variety of reasons as well, because it's a very different system to what we have over here in the UK.
That was fascinating. I listened to all of what she said. That was actually fascinating. Obviously, all the news and the images of the empty petrol stations all make it onto our sort of evening news shows. So that was really, really insightful. Also, that did give me time to think about what I should have said up front about myself, sort of introducing myself. So I guess I'll take that opportunity, because additionally to just making a YouTube video, I maybe should have mentioned that I'm also studying political science, and that I'm also working, well, not in Parliament, but sort of adjacent to Parliament. So I'm very much tuned into the sort of Berlin political bubble. So there's that credibility. The guest has credibility.
I joke I have a man in Westminster, because obviously the Bundestag is the building, but like what's like the region? I mean, I've been through Berlin, but I don't know if you refer to it in that way. Like we would say Westminster to mean all of the political surroundings, basically.
Yeah, so the Bundestag is actually the lower house of parliament. So that's the Bundestag, the very institution. The building is actually not the Bundestag, it's the Reichstag. So very much the old term, right? The Reichstag is the building. And I don't think we have a collective term for everything. Like you have Westminster, I guess just Berlin, broadly okay. Berlin.
You can be our man in Berlin, as it were,
Oh, great. Sounds like a Cold War spy thriller. Great. Yeah. I'm the man in Berlin. Great. Okay, so welcome to the part about the German election. I guess we should start with the very basics in case the listeners just don't know anything about Germany.
Yeah, I think it's probably a good idea. As I mentioned, the political system is quite a bit different to the first past the post system that we have here in the UK and also in the US. So I know there's a lot of depth to go into. We spent about 20 minutes on this in one of our special episodes a few years back. So maybe a brief overview just to show the differences and set the scene, I guess.
The systems aren't actually that different, the British and the German system. We're both a parliamentary system, so the election that we're going to cover was the equivalent of your general election for the House of Commons. The difference being, as you said, that the electoral system is quite different insofar that we get 2 votes on a ballot. One is the simple first-past-the-post system that you're used to as well, with a local geographically based candidate, right? And the second one is the dominant, because we also have this aspect of proportional representation. So in the end, the parliament will reflect sort of the popular vote. That sounds like a great system. I'm a big fan of it. New Zealand also uses it since the 1990s, I believe. And it's sort of it combines the best of both worlds, a sort of geographic representation and proportional representation. But it does have its flaws. We're not going to dwell on that.
Yeah, I think people often like to, and we saw this a lot when we had our referendum about AV, as we called it, in the UK for the alternative vote. There's a lot of kind of people see things as grass is always greener. Every system has its flaws, although
Definitely.
I think first past the post's flaws are very front and center at the moment.
Yeah, they're quite apparent. Let's say that. Sure. No, I can say without going being too detailed about it. The problem with our system is that it blows up the seat count. So if the two votes that we have on our ballot, if they diverge too much, if people vote too differently on the first vote and the second vote, the Bundestag can grow in size to unimaginable sizes. So I think we have about 200 too many MPs right now after this election, which is crazy. So both financially and for sort of the inner workings of government, I think Westminster has a fixed number of seats. We don't. The number of seats can vary a bit, and yeah, it's ginormous. I don't know how many chairs they're going to fit into that hall. I'm excited.
That is honestly something I hadn't realised from our previous discussions about the system, that it is variable like that. That's interesting.
I was going to ask about that, actually, just because there's 598 seats out there, 299 for your local and should be 299 for proportional representation. But then you have overhang seats, isn't it?
That's the base, exactly. And then the overhang seats that are necessary to accurately reflect the popular vote. Let's not get into it. I could show you, especially with graphs, but this is an audio medium, so we'll try to avoid that.
Is it basically first past the post we know is a skewed system, so you could have 5 politicians that are voted into the local seats, but actually that 5 is they're far overrepresented for what they got on the national side of vote, the other 299, so you have to add a few extra seats to balance it out, essentially. Is that right?
That's exactly it, right.
You can go on. I've derailed this conversation enough.
No, sure. It's fascinating. It's fascinating even to me. So we had our big general election this September, on the 26th of September, which was really exciting in so many ways. So I was born in 1998. I'm 23 right now. And Angela Merkel, the current chancellor, still current chancellor, has been in power since 2005. That's an amazing 16 years, meaning her inauguration was my first political memory, my first proper political memory. And this now being the first election where we actually get to pick a new leader was incredibly exciting, not only for me, but for the entire public, which is why I guess the Germans flocked to the internet this time around and had to really shout about the election.
So I just wanted to say that, like, it's an interesting point maybe to think of like first political memories. For comparison, like my first political memory is Tony Blair winning his landslide victory in 97. I'm a bit older than you, so that tracks, but it's also like to think that, you know, because I think did we have Blair for 12 years in the end?
Yes, from 97 to 2000.
I think that's correct. So that sounds about right. So to compare, that's like we had one government with 2 different leaders for less time than you have had one leader, which is when it's a democratically elected leader, that's kind of surprising.
Yeah, the Germans are just keen on stability. That's always the big thing. We like stable governments, and that's why we keep electing the same people. She's not even the record holder. The record holder is Helmut Kohl, who was elected when my mother was 8 years old, and he only left government after I was born. So that's a long time. But Mutti Merkel might actually crack this record if she stays in power for long enough. If the formation of the new government takes long enough and we're here until after Christmas, she might take the crown.
We're very used to over here. And our system is slightly quicker than the American system, where we wake up the next day and we know who's going to be prime minister, and they're already like talking about their cabinet, basically. Whereas in the US, it takes a bit longer. It's a bigger country, but I mean, Germany doesn't have that much more population than us. So why does it take so long to actually form a government after the result? Yeah,
we're definitely going to get into that. But due to proportional representation, we actually have 6 parties that really matter. And we never, except for one time, which everybody seems to have forgotten, we've never had a single party government since the foundation of this republic. It's always been at least 2 parties participating in government. And they, of course, need to get together after the election speed dating for a bit before they actually draw up a coalition agreement, which is not the norm in the UK or many Westminster-style systems. It's definitely the norm here. We do not have words for like hung parliament, or I don't know what the opposite would be, a majority parliament or whatever. We do not even have terms for that because the normal situation is coalition. It's always coalitions.
We never really had a touchstone for this until we actually had our own coalition government. And I think it took like 2 weeks or so to like dot the I's and cross the T's. But we still kind of knew it was going to be Conservatives and Lib Dems fairly early on. And it was just kind of the details of the agreement that took a while.
2 weeks,
but like,
that's...
Yeah, I know this. I'm trying to come up with comparisons here for the British audience, and it's like that was the closest I've ever got to understanding it. But it's very different to living through months, as it seems, of discussions.
If that's the case, I'm going to start this way. Election night in Germany is actually the polls, the voting stations all close at, I believe, 6 o'clock in the evening. Then the first polls come up on television. And the hosts sort of declare, okay, this party probably won this many seats, and this party probably won this many percent. And these are the coalition options, right? They show a big graph between the coalition options. And yeah, we do not know who has won.
I suppose before we can actually look at these results, I know that Rob and I have touched a bit on the various parties over the last few weeks, but we've definitely said we needed someone to come in and help us. So do you want to give us a rundown of those 6 main parties you mentioned?
Yeah, sure. So first off, you can obviously watch my excellent YouTube video on that. So you can go and type in German political parties explained. But basically, it's not too different from the UK in that we have one big party of the center left, the Social Democratic Party, which is our Labour Party, which is what I'm going to refer to them from now on, Labour Party, and then the Christian Democratic Union, which is Angela Merkel's party, which is our Conservative Party, right? And then on either side, they are joined on the center left with the Green Party. They are usually the natural partner of the Labour Party. And then on the right side, we have the Liberals, which are somewhat different and somewhat similar to your Lib Dems. In foreign media, they're usually dubbed as the business-friendly liberals, right? They're very much on all about individual liberty and I guess capitalist in the brief sense, but it's more varied, obviously. And then on the sort of fringes of parliament, although I do not want to equate the two, but we have the sort of far-left socialists who are interestingly the sort of descendants of the former ruling party of the East German regime, like from the communist regime that rules East Germany in the Cold War. They've since changed and emancipated from that, but they're very much on the left fringe. And then on the right fringe, we have the somewhat new right-wing, I guess, far-right populist party, the Alternative for Germany. Although for this very episode, I think we can mainly focus on the center four, so the Labour Party and the Greens on the left, and the Conservatives and the Liberals on the right.
Am I right in thinking you've got your 2 main parties, the CDU and the SDP, but the FGP and the Greens, are they the sort of kingmakers in the coalition? Are those the ones that you're wanting to court if you want to have a workable coalition, or do the 2 main parties ever decide to join together to make a grand coalition? Which is more common in those scenarios when you're building your government?
Yes and no. So I guess we're going to touch on that later after the result, but the general natural state of German parliaments is the Conservatives and the Liberals, as I said, form one natural coalition, basically, versus the Labour Party and the Greens. That's sort of the normal state. However, because we also have these other 2 parties, there's a lot of mathematical shenanigans going on. So these coalitions, those natural coalitions, sometimes do not get the majority they campaigned for. So for 3 out of the 4 cabinets of Angela Merkel, we actually had a thing called Grand Coalition, which I guess is similar to your, was it a government of national unity or something?
Yes.
Which you had, I think, during war times, where the Conservatives and the Labour Party, which are the biggest parties and have always been since the founding of the Republic, they've teamed up, which is dissatisfactory to everyone involved. It's a forced marriage, not a marriage out of love. And that's been happening in the 3 out of the 4 last governments. That's sort of the situation that we're starting with. It's a grand coalition between Conservatives and Labour Party that existed right up until now. And we had the election to get in new people. Okay, so now we're looking at the graph, the result of the German general election that happened. What's sort of the first thing that hits your eye? We can really start anywhere.
For me, and Rob may have some other points, but the most striking thing I would say is that the biggest number is red, and red is SPD, which is also Labour. So fortunately for us, that's easy for us to understand because red is Labour over here as well. So yeah, it looks like if you were looking at this in a first past the post system, you'd say, well, Labour's won the majority of the votes. May not be the majority of the seats, but you go, well, Labour's won the popular vote.
Exactly. And that, believe it or not, was extremely shocking. So the SPD, the Labour Party, was the minor coalition partner in the ongoing grand coalition that I just mentioned. They were always sort of under the foot of Merkel's Conservatives. Nobody thought they had any chance. They were basically pronounced dead by all the major newspapers. Years before this was happening, the Labour Party has been losing in basically every election since 2005, right? And to see them actually come out on top was extremely shocking for a couple of reasons. The Labour Party has obviously been losing not only because maybe their policies were controversial or something, but because they have an aging voter base, right? Probably similar to your Labour Party. The sort of classic blue-collar workers dying out, so they had a real structural problem in their voter base. There's been constant infighting, as is usual with, I guess, any proper centre-left party in this world. There's always infighting between a more left-wing part and a moderate part, a sort of Tony Blair kind of third-way part. And that all changed really in the last couple of weeks of this election. So for the most part, in the month of this election process, the media basically covered this election as a runoff between the Conservatives, Merkel's Conservatives, and the Green Party, actually, which was another big thing in this election. So the Greens, who had always been a minor player, a really minor player, they were the smallest party in the last parliament. They actually set out to compete with the Conservative Party. The SPD was pronounced dead, no chance they're going to come on top, and they did.
Looking at the vote share, I'm surprised to see that the CDU has dropped 8.9 percentage points since their last election as well. And you said the Greens were going to do well, but the fact that they've become 10 points behind the SDP is the factor of who was going to be Chancellor. Do you think that led people to vote the way they did? Because this is clearly the first time that we've got Merkel out of the picture. Is the CDU without Merkel a much less attractive prospect for the German people? Now that they haven't got her, essentially? And was the Green candidate for Chancellor also, did the media think that they weren't up to the job?
Let's leave the Labour Party for a minute. We're going to come back to them later. The Conservatives had an absolutely horrendous night. This is the worst result ever. Never been lower. It's an incredible, 24%? That's almost 9% down from the already really disappointing result in 2017. And the main reason for that was not because the Labour Party was really strong or anything. No, they were woefully unprepared for Merkel's departure. So as I said in the beginning, she had 16 years in office, 16 years of the Conservatives dominating the coalition between them and the Labour Party. And so the Conservative Party was kind of stuck between, what's the saying, a rock and a hard place? I love that saying. And they sort of had to defend this long time in government, 16 years in office, say, oh, everything was beautiful, the country grew, the economy was doing well, while also offering some sort of new chapter after Merkel, right? That new chapter, that name was Armin Laschet, the first Chancellor candidate that we might talk about now. He's a Conservative premier. Germany has 16 states, and each of them are headed by what I like to call a premier, maybe a governor, like a little prime minister of that state. He's quite successful as that premier, and it was sort of thought that he might be a good candidate to follow in the footsteps of Angela Merkel. He's very much in the same kind of moderate Christian line that she's always been in as well. But basically his candidacy has been doomed from the get-go, we might say.
And do you think that was the main reason for their loss of 9%, essentially picking a poor chancellor?
Definitely. I think I'm not really pulling something out of the hat here. Armin Laschet is definitely the biggest mistake of the Conservative Party. Although, as I said, it's also a structural problem. They were not prepared to leave Merkel behind. So there was this whole infighting in the party about which direction the party is going to go into after Merkel's departure. There are three wings when we're talking about the Conservative Party: the sort of Christian wing, a sort of liberal wing, and then a very conservative wing. And the conservatives in the Conservative Party, sort of the right of the right, they were very adamant to claim the party for themselves. Finally, after years of moderation, Angela Merkel was famously a very moderate chancellor, very sort of very centrist, everybody could get on board with her. She's this lovely, cuddly lady that's absolutely inoffensive. And the Conservatives, they were really hoping to take back control, to use that phrase, right? And there was a lot of infighting, which he was hurt by tremendously. So Armin Laschet not only ran a poor campaign where he, as I said, had to juggle this 16 good years, but also something new with a lot of infighting within his party.
So from the Greens' perspective, if I knew nothing about their high polling before, looking at a rise of 5.9%, I'd say, that's a great night for the Greens. Well done. So why did that night become so disappointing for them? Did the media overestimate them? Did they think they were better than they are? Or
the Greens had both a good and a bad night. So for the listeners, we might have to say, so the Labour Party and the Conservatives are obviously in first and second place, a very narrow second place, I might add. And then the Greens are off on third place with a tremendous rise, but still just third place. So the Greens actually made headlines, international headlines, that some of you may have seen. They became increasingly popular since the last election, where, as I said before, they came in last place. That's not unprecedented. A rise of the Greens has been happening around 2011, when the famous Fukushima disaster happened in Japan. And the Green Party had a massive surge back then. That's when they won their first state. They became the biggest party in that state. There's still a Green premier in Baden-Württemberg, that southern state. So the Greens very much are used to sometimes surging in the polls, but that's usually followed by a quick drop-off. But still, it's not unprecedented, and some people thought, naturally, they might have a shot at this. And after months and months of polling as second or even first place, they were kind of, we might actually have a chance at this. Let's, for the first time ever, bring in a third chancellor candidate to rival the Conservatives and that Labour Party, which has been polling tremendously badly over the last few months.
You mentioned chancellor candidate there. So are you saying, I'm trying to compare this. So we were talking about how, we really only have two parties. Generally, we did briefly have a coalition with the Lib Dems, but in the last general election, the leader of the Lib Dems was kind of saying, look, I could actually be prime minister. And then that didn't turn out to be true at all, but that was like one of the things they said. So when you say a chancellor candidate, is that something more official? Is that like they're on the ballot as a chancellor candidate, or is that just people were thinking, she's now in the running, as it were?
It's very much a sort of a gimmick. There's not an official document where you have to say, I'm a chancellor candidate. It's just something you say. Let me ask you this. What was sort of the media's reaction to that Lib Dem politician claiming they had a shot?
Rob might have a better memory of this. I think it's laughter, maybe?
Yeah, like laughter. It's seen as, I think, typically in most established democracies, particularly where you have two very strong parties, when a third candidate comes along and says, hey, what about a change? A lot of people are keen about that change, but when it comes to the reality of picking them as that leader, people tend to fall back on what they already know and trust. So they're not willing to take the risk on that third party. They go, I think I'd rather maybe have one of these big two. They've run the country in the past. At least we know that. They're not going to be as unpredictable as this third candidate. So that's the kind of, I think that's exactly the reaction you get on the night. And yeah, like you say, maybe one of the factors for the Green Party here.
Exactly. It's seen as ridiculous, isn't it? That a third-party candidate, and again, that's never really happened, would establish themselves as a real alternative. Some people have tried in the past, but been convinced out of it in the past. We've only had TV debates between two candidates, but this time around with the Greens, again, they were polling so high that everybody in the entire country was basically, from the get-go, like, yeah, I guess we now have 3 chancellor candidates, which is unprecedented. I don't know why everybody's treating it as normal as it is, but we genuinely have, at the same time, 3 people running for the top job. Sadly for the Greens, that candidate was Annalena Baerbock, one of their leaders, which might or might not have hurt them. So the Greens had been searching in the polls, not out of just out of the blue, but because of basically 3 reasons. So again, as I said, the Labour Party had been almost dead. They had been pronounced dead. There's a vacuum on the centre-left, which they very much filled. The second reason being that the climate in general, climate change, had been front of mind ever since those climate protests had begun. Greta Thunberg is a very prominent figure there, and the Fridays for Future protests had basically occupied every city in Germany in the last few years. It was very noticeable. Front of mind topic. Those are the main 2 reasons, let's say. Yeah, and that had been sort of chugging along. Again, the Conservatives were on top at one point in the campaign season, then the Greens, then the Conservatives again, then the Greens.
It was certainly interesting because we do our poll segment at the end of most episodes, and without, there's no UK and US elections on the horizon. I mean, let's not get started on US midterms, but we'll cover those when they turn up. We don't tend to follow them. Yeah, I mean, we're interested, but we tend not to follow those too far out. And we were like looking around for our next election to look at, and Canada didn't look particularly interesting. Which I don't think we ended up not covering Canada because they basically voted exactly the same way. If for listeners who are like, oh, where's the Canada episode? Sorry, Canada, you didn't do anything interesting this time around. But we were watching the polls with great interest, and I remember, I'm pretty certain we touched on the Greens. There must have been was it about 6 months ago that the Greens were doing really well? Yeah.
At the start of 2021, about through March and May, they were sort of the dominant party, if I recall.
Yeah, and as you say, like that made international news. It was like, look, a Green party, because I think there's this kind of interesting thing where it's like the Greens in UK politics have never really got anywhere big, but they've made a lot of noise despite only having like 1 MP. That they. The problem that it feels like with the Greens in the UK is that not only are they a third party thing in a first past the post system, but also that like even the Conservatives are a bit green now, or at least that's how they like to present it. I mean, real green activists will say, well, the Conservatives aren't green, but the Conservatives are like, well, we're going to plant a load of trees. We've talked about it in manifestos before. So I think the idea that a Green party could potentially win an election is the reason that story went around, because people are like, because I'm kind of surprised actually by what you were saying earlier about how the Greens were, because to my impression, because they were part of the coalition, I was like, the Greens has always been quite a strong force in German politics compared to us having a single MP. But I suppose it's a different of degrees, right? When there's hundreds more members of parliament, then it changes as well.
Yeah, I mean, the Greens were a force to be reckoned with, but only a very minor force, right? So they were part of a government between 1998 and 2005, right? The predecessor government to Angela Merkel was under Gerhard Schröder, the Labour Party and the Greens. So they were in power, but as a very minor player. Nobody thought they could actually go for the top spot. And the third reason that I couldn't remember before, but I can now, is that our Green Party differs a bit from sort of the international mainstream Green Party. They've become more moderate, I guess, more sort of softer around the edges, right? They're not talking down on everybody. They've emancipated from their veggie days where they wanted to they presented themselves as very much the party of forbidding stuff, right? Of the party of bans and prohibition, basically. And they've sort of emancipated themselves from that and really broadened their appeal across the board.
Thought I'd make a quick UK comparison in my head for what this election screams at me, or at least the one that it seems to equate the most to me, which is the 2012 election, which was the one between Brown, Cameron and Clegg, where the UK saw the rise of the Lib Dems, the third party, as Nick Clegg, Nobody had ever thought they could consider him as a prime minister before. But all of a sudden, he was very clearly outperforming the 12 years in government. Sorry, 30. How many years have they been in? 2012, 15 years in government. Labour Party that is ailing, against a Conservative Party that is weak, and the country isn't quite sure if they want them back in power either. And this third party comes out of nowhere, and all of a sudden they're surging in the polls, and everybody went, "Oh my goodness, they're going to win! They're definitely going to win!" And then in the end, shock of all shocks, the Conservatives win it, but only just, and need to go into a coalition. This election feels like very much it is literally a transition election, isn't it? From the age of Merkel into nobody knows quite what, and no one candidate is standing head and shoulders above the other, because the results, your Labour Party did win in the end, but by the skin of their teeth, and required a huge dip in the CDU vote for that to even happen.
But the Labour Party would very much disagree with you right now, obviously. Our Labour Party celebrated, like they haven't celebrated since, again, like 2005. Every election season, the SPD, the Labour Party leader, had to go in front of the cameras and say, this was a terrible day for social democracy across Europe. We lost the election again with even larger margins than before. And this is the first time they've ever won anything. And might be the chance for me to actually introduce the person that was responsible for this, because this was a very personality-driven election. Unprecedented, maybe. So again, as I said, Armin Laschet, the Conservative Party, the Chancellor candidate of the Conservative Party, was definitely one reason why the Conservative Party went down. And the exact opposite happened for the Labour Party. They nominated Olaf Scholz. Scholz was also a premier of Hamburg, which is a city-state in the north. And he's also been a politician basically all his life. He's currently the finance minister and the vice chancellor under Angela Merkel. That's not to compare him to sort of the vice president in the United States, who's always on board with the president. They are elected together. That's not the case in Germany. The vice chancellor is just usually just the most important politician of the biggest coalition partner. And since the Conservatives and the Labour Party had both been governing together since 2005, he was sort of the main man of the SPD. And they basically had nobody else. Again, I can't stress this enough. Just a year ago, we thought the Labour Party was gone, dead. They had nobody else but Olaf Scholz. And everybody sort of smiled at him for the last couple of months. But Scholz constantly said it to every camera that would listen to him, no, all I need is a weak win, 20%, bit above 20%, and I can become chancellor. And everybody really laughed at him. But that's exactly what happened. So Scholz is not without controversies. His own party very much was torn about him. As I said, the Labour Party suffers from the same sort of infighting as most left-wing parties do. And Scholz is very much from the moderate, reserved kind of wing of the party, whereas the party on the whole has been drifting towards the left ever more, very much in the sort of modern fashion of social democrats rediscovering sort of more traditionally socialist ideas around the world, right? So it was weird to then suddenly see the entire party rally behind him, because they understood, hold on, those other candidates aren't really doing that well. Armin Laschet didn't do well with all of his sort of bumbling around. He's a very cheerful kind of guy from the Rhineland. He's very much stepped onto every trap that was laid out for him. And Annalena Baerbock was seen as unprepared, maybe. I might have to add that the Green Chancellor candidate has never held executive office before, so she was seen as too new, too young, or that's in a very sort of paternalistic way, patronizing way, or that girl doesn't know what she's talking about. That was sort of the attitude of the other parties towards Annalena Baerbock. So then the Labour Party realized, wait, hold on, we have an experienced politician here who's decently controversial, but come on, who isn't, right? That was sort of the attitude. And we can really win if we rally around him. And that sort of truce between the moderate wing of the party and the left wing has really, that's the way they won. In the last weeks before the election, really the last weeks, where sort of TV debates were happening and everybody was less concerned about the real themes and topics of this campaign, they were all just preoccupied with choosing, oh God, who's going to follow Angela Merkel in her footsteps? That was really a question we only asked ourselves in the Well, during the entire campaign, but it became tangible when the TV debates were happening in the last couple of weeks. Then suddenly there was a great surge in the Labour numbers. And that's when Olaf Scholz really was discovered by the nation.
Would you say it's sort of like a victory for moderate socialism? Only because looking at that graph, you've got Linke there that's gone down 4.3%. And I know that they're sort of the far left party. Did that play into how people voted at all? Or is that kind of coincidental?
It's difficult to say. I saw international headlines trying to put a clear message, to pull a clear message out of this election, where they sort of said, this was a win for moderate politics, this was a win for the left in Germany. It's a bit more complicated for that. So what definitely is true, it was a win for this type of candidate that Olaf Scholz is, which is very much this sort of Angela Merkel, I'm just a grey politician doing my work kind of person. Apparently, Germans just do not want a flamboyant leader. I guess because we had our experiences with flamboyant leaders in the 40s. But it just seems that that's the winning formula. And again, Olaf Scholz is from the Labour Party, which is the natural rival of the Conservatives. And yet he had this aura that Angela Merkel had for ages. He even jokingly did her hand gesture. I don't know if you know this little diamond shape. This is a very ubiquitous popular shape that she does with her hands, that gesture. He did that on the front cover of a famous newspaper, sort of jokingly insisting that he's the true heir, despite all the political differences, to Angela Merkel's style of politics, of just being reserved and quiet and doing a job. He's a pocket calculator in person, right? That's Olaf Scholz.
Lovely.
It's very funny, kind of the comparison here, where the one time that I remember, obviously Rob will be able to give probably more examples back in the past because he studied this more than I have, but we had Gordon Brown basically ran on that kind of, look, I'm the safe pair of hands, I've been the Chancellor, and didn't win. And we tend to, I suppose we don't go for necessarily demagoguery, but we go...
No, but certainly a sort of... British charm. I get it. And it's very interesting to look at that, right? So because French presidents always have to have this royal attitude towards them. And then Boris is what?
A lot of words for Boris.
There's a lot of words for Boris,
Sure.
but there's that kind of, he has this kind of, buffoonery aspect, which is kind of a show. And he was been cultivating that for years, because he used to be on like our comedy shows as a guest.
Yeah, I know.
Even up until the time
I
he
knew
was
him
mayor.
since... I started not even caring for politics, but learning English. I knew about Boris Johnson. And Germany just seems to fall into the category that's not very popular on the world stage. That's just, we want people that are as grey and dull as possible, which is weird, but that's how things are. And I'm actually kind of glad about it.
How I envy your political system. I think I would I would kill for a dull leader right now, to be honest. But yeah.
Oh gosh. Yeah, I believe you, and I understand that. And that sort of romanticizing of Merkel's attitude, because she obviously had opponents. People really complained that her style of always compromising sort of damaged debate culture in Germany. I think you can make that argument, really, especially since we had this government of national unity, this grand coalition, where the major left-wing party and the major right-wing party were in coalition with each other. German politics became extremely placid over the last couple of decades, right? So you can argue that this is actually not helpful for democracy. But certainly there was a big romanticization of that style of leadership, especially during the Trump years, when that was sort of on the news all the time, Donald Trump. And people have they developed this real separation anxiety from Angela Merkel and feared what might follow. But apparently, again, it might just be another Merkel.
I can see how Merkel and Trump are sort of diametrically opposed there. They are the opposite ends of the scale, aren't they? And if you see the potential chaos you could get with something like America, or even as, like, our lovely introduction in the papers and what's happening over here with our style of leadership, I think there might be a certain longing for, I don't need them to have a personality, I just need them to be quiet and competent at their job, thank you very much, which is why I would be like, yes, please. I'd like one of those leaders, thank you very much.
I understand that. Yeah.
Did you want to kind of just touch on the slightly smaller parties so that we can cover them? Because I imagine, we've mentioned Linke briefly. We've touched on FDP, but we haven't mentioned AfD much, who are, the Alternative for Deutschland, which is essentially the equivalent of our kind of UKIP party, which is now not UKIP. I keep forgetting because they changed themselves to like Reform in this cunning attempt to be voted for, but it didn't work.
Yeah, were they the Brexit party at one point, or was that a different thing? I forgot.
They were the Brexit party,
that.
Yeah, sorry, Reform was the Brexit party and UKIP became that, and then we had Britain First, which was a completely separate thing.
Not confusing at all, sure.
Yeah. It got confusing, but they keep changing their names, but they don't get many votes. So that's fine by me.
I guess let's stick with the AfD then. So the AfD is, again, this very new party. It only was founded in 2013, then as a very Eurocritical party, which is not normal for German politics. Obviously, we are sort of at the center of the EU. That's always said, like Germany is the informal leader of the EU, although we are not really happy to accept that responsibility as the voters. It's not really a popular thing to say in Germany because we really don't want that responsibility. But anyway, so our Conservative Party, in different to your Conservative Party, is very much pro-European. Every party is, right? The Conservative, the Labour Party, the Green Party, the Liberal Party, they're all big on pro-European integration. And then suddenly the AfD came along to say, no, we actually are far a bit more critical of the European Union. We want to abolish the euro, and that was sort of the starting point for that movement. And that sort of was, infiltrated or just joined by further right forces. Definitely some far-right demagogues. The leader of the Thuringian branch, so one state branch of the AfD, is famously court-approved. It's court-approved that you can call him a fascist because he has fascist ideals, which is a word I don't like using all that much because the internet has really taught me that people try to scream that at everybody. But so the AfD is very much a mixed bag that has been edging ever closer to far-right politics, and we'll see where they're going. But I think the English the term that's always used in English media is a French one, which is cordon sanitaire or something, where the other parties really close them off from the political conversation. There's no cooperation with the AfD at all. That's kind of the consensus between all the other parties to keep them small. But the thing is, they couldn't quite. So if we actually take a look at something that doesn't appear much on German televisions on election nights, which is a map of the country, again, we don't have a strong geographic-based system, so we don't really see maps on election night. We only see like bar graphs. But if we actually look at the districts won by each party, where the parties were the strongest, you see in 2017 that was, although that was a very weak showing of the Conservative Party, basically the entire country is black, conservative black. It was a wipeout, a few red freckles here and there, and then a bit of light blue of the AfD in the very far east of the country, right? And then you'll notice that when we jump to 2021, there's much more red for the Labour Party, because again, they won this election, so that's hardly surprising. Very much along the sort of Catholic and Protestant lines across the country. I won't go into that, but there's this famous sort of persevering divide between formerly conservative and Protestant places, which is quite interesting, which were to then the South very much sticks to the conservative Catholic writing, and then the North is very much red. But the interesting part here is the light blue, the AfD, they really took power over there.
This is an interesting map because it's, so when you say this is districts, is this, so each one of these is electing someone to parliament, or is it more narrow than that?
That's even more narrowed down. So the lowest unit that you can have for these kinds of measurements, right? So if you collect a couple of them, they have one candidate.
And then the other thing, so I mean, I can see where Berlin is. That's obvious, but so I'm trying to compare, because we're always able to do this with UK politics. We go, well, that's the countryside because it's blue, and that's the city because it's red.
Yes.
And
none of that here.
Yeah. It's interesting to see such a different map.
We do have a strong city and rural divide, urban and rural divide. You can see a few small but recognizable green specks, right? because the Greens actually were very strong in the major urban centers. They are very much an urban party. And they actually got a few mandates, direct mandates, first past the post votes, right, and secured the bigger cities. So that's very much the Greens. But in the rest of the country, where it's more rural, it was basically a three-way battle. A two-way battle between Conservatives and Labour, with the exception of the former East. Like, if we were to redraw the lines of the firm separation between East Germany and West Germany during the Cold War, which again were two separate countries, in case any listeners don't know. I imagine your listeners are quite young. So Germany used to be divided until 1990. And if we trace that line, that border, the former East is just recognizably light blue, whereas the West is not. So the eastern states really, the AfD really established itself in the eastern states. And the candidate said, that's the quote I was looking for, the other parties tried to make us a one-off phenomenon. So the other parties very much declared, oh yes, the AfD got us into parliament in 2017, because again, they're so new. This was their first term in parliament. But we surely will beat them by the next election. There won't even be a problem anymore. But then she said, yeah, we proved them wrong and we're here to stay, basically. And that's basically what happened. The East now has an established regional party that, as I said, is sort of a mixed bag between really nationalist conservatives and just outright far-right populists and extremists. That's definitely worrying from my sort of centrist moderate perspective.
I don't think I've ever met someone who is a UKIPper in the UK. Like, they get together and they go on marches and stuff, but I've never actually met one in person and had a conversation with them. But I have met someone who was considering maybe voting AfD, and I made me re-evaluate them when I heard that. But I think I suppose it's a bit like when, people were voting for Brexit, and we had that similar kind of conversation within the UK where you suddenly were like, people I thought were rational are making what seems like an irrational decision. So yeah, it's kind of, I think there's been a lot of that in politics recently where people have suddenly realised
there's a whole other world, right?
Yeah.
And the AfD, the thing is, I refrain from going after the voters because I think there are sort of understandable reasons why you might lean towards the AfD. I think that it's misjudged, but there are certain reasons, especially why the former East is voting the AfD so much. Because, so there are basically common reasons that are often stated why the East has so willingly embraced this controversial far-right party, right? The one is the sort of upheaval of society that they experienced in 1990, their weariness of change. So many people are saying, people in the former East really just a couple of years ago experienced the utter failure of their government and system, right? So it's just, we recently celebrated 30 years of reunification, and people kind of forget that this is really recent memory for many people. It was the utter failure of a state. The fall of the Berlin Wall is, of course, this iconic image of happiness and coming together, and really one of the most joyous moments of German history. But let's not forget this. It was a tremendous amount of work to actually get that going. And the common knowledge nowadays is that the West basically treated the East unfairly, really sucked it dry, and sort of rolled over it. Many people lost their jobs back then. It's one of those things that's, it's not surprising that the country is still divided 30 years after. The second reason is that the East has traditionally, and especially after 1990, been economically worse off.
I think that's fair if you compare it to the UK and the rise of our kind of like UKIP and Reform and whatever. Those parties are kind of, it's that culture war aspect of they kind of harken back to another era, and that's where they're able to base their political rather than any kind of big policies. It's more cultural issues that they seem to be able to get people to vote for them. So yeah, I feel though those feelings of populism, like they are a populist party. Democracy has a populism problem at the moment with these type of parties growing in aspects. So yeah, no, I totally see the comparisons there.
The polarized ends of that sort of culture war debate are definitely the AfD on one side and the Greens on the other side. That's very much the dynamic, exactly.
So trying to draw parallels again, because we've discussed like West versus East, which is like your equivalent of the kind of country versus town that we have. The other thing that's often discussed, and we like to discuss here when we're talking about, where we might see politics going in the future in the UK, is the kind of, there's a lot of younger people coming through now, and they tend to vote more left-wing in the UK. Is that the same in Germany, and how does that kind of compare?
Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to talk about. So in Britain, as I understand it, it's very much that the younger generation really is on board with left-wing politics, whereas the older generation definitely leans to the Tories, right? And that's quite the pronounced difference, as I understand it. And that's very much not the case in Germany. The big divide, as it turns out in this election, was that the older folks prefer the bigger parties by quite the large margins. So the biggest two parties on the older side, if we look at like people 70 and older, they elected the Conservatives and the Labour Party by big margins. So there's no left-right divide. They equally voted for the centre-right and the centre-left. But young people, like first-time voters or people under 25, their biggest party were not Labour, not the Conservative Party. It was actually the Greens and the Liberals. So the smaller parties, which that might be the most discussed thing in the aftermath of this election. This is really important. So the younger people prefer the Greens and the Liberals, which again, a liberal can be a confusing term. The Liberals are definitely centre-right. So there's a centre-left and a centre-right party, both. There are big ones and there are smaller ones. The older generation prefers the big ones. The younger generation, the smaller ones. Now, we can get into why that is. The thing that you got to remember, as I said, the 3 out of the last 4 Merkel cabinets were a grand coalition, right? The Conservative and the Labour Party. So the two parties that were most out for change, that were not involved in this government, were the Greens on the left side, the Liberals on the right side. That's exactly what the young people voted for. That's what they want. It's change. It's honestly just, it's change.
In some ways, you can see, because I appreciate there's a bit of a difference, but like the way it kind of works in the UK is that Conservatives are seen as the traditional party. They're seen as they're the party of stability is the idea, and they're the more sensible financially as well. Is kind of the general feeling. Whether that's true or not, that's the kind of the view people in general tend to have. And then Labour's kind of, they're a bit more out there, and as I say, Labour's not necessarily very left wing all the time, but they're kind of seen as that. But then we do have the Greens as kind of the really left wing party as well, but they're so much smaller in general. It's not as clear as saying there's not the same thing, but it is a bit different. It's kind of like different bits of that are spread apart. So I could see that people, older people saying, well, these are the two parties I know and they're the ones I can trust, versus the one that wants to move fast and break things, to use the Facebook term.
No, that's exactly it. Yes. And actually, when it was revealed on election night that young people disproportionately voted for both the Liberals and the Greens, there was this big outcry in sort of left-wing spaces, traditionally left-wing spaces, that the youth is now electing what, of course, they are electing the Greens. They've been marching with Greta Thunberg. But what about the Liberal Party? And we haven't spoken about the Liberal Party just yet. More traditionally left-wingers were very much offended by young people then voting for the Liberal Party, because the Liberals are very much seen as sort of the turbo capitalist, right, by the left. So the Liberals let's rewind there a bit. Despite a few scandals in the last few years, the Liberals actually managed to get a really good result. They were one of the 3 winning parties on election night. So the Labour Party obviously won a lot because of Olaf Scholz again. The Greens, despite losing a bit and definitely not getting near the chancellery, still had their best showing ever. They came in 3rd, which is great. And the FDP also won a commendable bit. And that was mostly fueled by young people again. And people have kind of been struggling to predict this. This was not very much common knowledge that the Liberal Party would sort of result in a big showing of young people. The main arguments why that happened for many people is that the FDP, the Liberals, are very much a digital party. Germany has been struggling with digitization. The Chancellor Angela Merkel once famously said, in her very neutral way, well, the internet is virgin territory for all of us. Das Internet ist für uns alle Neuland, which has been ridiculed ever since. It's become sort of a popular meme in Germany. The internet is virgin territory, and there are a lot of cartoons of her sort of standing on the new shore of the internet like Columbus, but the whole world has already discovered the internet before her. That's very much the sense. And the FDP is then the liberals very much pushing for a digital revolution. They want a ministry for digitization, right? Liberals are very much the party of individual freedom, right? And you could see how that kind of party would win in a time where big government is sort of restricting day-to-day life during the corona pandemic, right? And the FDP started sort of rocky when corona hit. Some people were trying to claim, the liberals are COVID deniers, but they quickly sort of formed a strategy of criticizing COVID rules in a sensible way, and that hit sort of fertile ground. Many students who were first-time voters in this election were sort of sick of COVID rules and the sort of paradoxical nature of COVID rules, and that's why the liberals really won big. And it's the first time, I might have to add, they actually got a 2-digit result back to back. Usually they are struggling to even get into parliament, so they're polling around 5 to 6%. There's a 5% threshold to get in. And this is the first time they really defended their 2 digits and even improved on them. They got about 10%, 11% last time, and 11.5% this time. So it was a good evening for the Liberal Party.
Thanks for that context, because I was looking at plus 0.8%. Why is that particularly good? So without knowing that they struggle to normally stay up, I wouldn't have understood why that small win was seen as good.
That was sort of a real, not shocker. I might be cocky in saying that, by being from the younger generation, I really saw that many people were sort of leaning towards Greens and Liberals, and that they were seen as the progressive options, right, on the centre left and on the centre right.
Kind of tying into that as well. One thing we've looked at before when we've looked at British general elections is, and also I suppose when we've been, maybe to a lesser extent, we've looked at the US, is we've kind of looked at where are voters moving. So we've kind of discussed a bit like the different sides. How does this shift from where, say, young people were at the last election?
Ooh, good question. I actually don't have data on where young people were last time. I guess in the same kind of direction. The Green Party has obviously always been quite popular with young people. But when you're talking about voter movement, the really exciting bit is when we look at the Conservative Party, actually. So the Conservative Party, as we said, took home this really big loss, mostly faulted to their Chancellor candidate. The common knowledge, if I asked anybody, well, the Conservative Party is losing in a multi-party system. Who are they losing to? The common response would be, well, to other centre-right parties, surely, because in a true sort of multi-party system where there's not just 2 dominant parties in a first-past-the-post system, voters usually stay within their bloc, right? The sort of traditionally centre-right, centre-left bloc, and the parties in that bloc sort of lose votes to each other. That's this common wisdom, which would suggest that the Conservatives within the Conservative Party were right. We need a stronger, staunch right-wing party. But that was definitely not the case this time. So a lot of the voter base left actually for the Labour Party and for the Greens, which was not expected probably. They were sort of leaking towards the left, right? And they were also losing to, well, especially in when you look at gender, of their losses, 12% they lost 12% of their female voters, but only 6% of their male voters. So their 2 big sort of failures were to captivate the minds of a female voter and of younger people, as well as of people to the center of the spectrum, who then went over to the Greens and the Labour Party. So that's going to be actually quite exciting for the future of the Conservative Party, because the conventional wisdom was, okay, after Merkel leaves, that moderate chancellor, we never really quite got along with her in her own party. Surely we can turn this conservative ship around and, establish ourselves as a more conservative party, which will surely get back some of those far-right voters in the AfD. But that just didn't happen. Nearly all of the their voter base fled to left-wing parties, which is going to be interesting looking at how the Conservatives are reinventing themselves in the coming future. I just got the message in just about an hour before we started recording, actually, that Armin Laschet finally sort of declared, okay, he might be open to stepping down and allowing for more change. It's going to be exciting to watch who's going to succeed him and how the Conservative Party is going to develop. If they take this result at face value, that would mean sort of opening up to more centrist voters and becoming more digital and female, I guess. But maybe not. We'll see.
Those themes seem to be kind of universal at the moment. Like, you're seeing young demographics moving away from traditional politics, but what that new politics is, nobody's quite sure yet. It's certainly come to fruition yet.
So the next step, obviously, after looking at the election results, would be, well, then what's that going to mean? Who's going to form the next government, the next coalition, right? That's the big thing. And as I said, on election night, we don't know who won on election night, although the Labour Party was very adamant to immediately celebrate their win, their very narrow victory, and say, yeah, we have a mandate to form a coalition. But the thing is, it seems to be in style these days that the opponents don't concede, right? We were sort of traumatized by Trump, obviously, but it's seeming to become a bit more popular these days. So the Conservative Party, which again took home the worst election defeat in history, their Conservative Chancellor candidate, Armin Laschet, said on election night, well, sure, I guess we lost, but we are open for coalition talks and leading the next government. That's not as big a scandal as Trump saying, oh, I didn't lose, this election was rigged. It's not that, very much not that. I got to defend the Conservatives on that one.
There's a nice, the hemicircular BBC graphics they tend to use to show how the different parties have done in UK elections. They've done the equivalent with the same data. And it's striking when you look at the number of seats that it's only 10 seats different between the Labour and CDU-CSU. So that's what needs to be considered here. It's not someone say, when you're talking about coalition building, you can have a minority, you can have the people who didn't win the most votes form a coalition, especially when the Greens are sat there with a lot at 118. That is a lot.
And that's not unprecedented in Germany. So I just said it was sort of a bit scandalous and people were sort of drawing parallels to Trump, but that was not sort of a reasonable response because we've actually had experiences with some of our governments getting in with not the winning party, but the second, the party that got in second. One of our most famous chancellors, Willy Brandt, his second government, as far as I'm aware, and certainly Helmut Schmidt's governments were not the winning party. It was the second biggest party and the third biggest party teaming up. So it wasn't without reason that Armin Laschet would actually claim, oh no, I'm up actually for the chancellor. He's still. The only thing that sort of made this claim weird was because, again, it was very apparent that Germans overwhelmingly preferred Olaf Scholz, the chancellor candidate of the Labour Party, rather than him. So it's still debated as to, was this a good idea of him to actually claim, no, we're still in the run. And as I said, just today the news broke that he was actually accepting sort of his role in the failure of his party and that he might be stepping down. His prominent members of his own party had already tried to convince him very publicly that, no, this is a loss. We will probably not lead the next government. We should just shut up and leave the floor to the Labour Party and reinvent ourselves in the opposition.
Just one thing I wanted to ask here, just for, again, the kind of context for people. We discussed it. It doesn't immediately happen. Obviously, the election didn't happen yesterday. This isn't like with our normal UK election kind of summaries. If we were to kind of try and map out, because you mentioned earlier, if this goes on into the new year, which it implies a kind of a long and lengthy process that's very different to how we do things over here. So what's the precedent essentially for how long it can take?
In case anybody was wondering, Germany is not without a government after the election. So the old government very much stays in power. Angela Merkel will remain chancellor with her cabinet in sort of caretaker position until a new government is formed. And that formation of the new government can take a long time. It may very well not. So the traditional duration of government formation was about between, let's say, 30 to 50 days, right? That was sort of the normal situation, which is not terribly long, but it's decently long in world politics. And but Germany is currently scarred from our experiences with coalition talks in 2017, the last election. Because in the last election, everything looked like, after, again, a grand coalition already ended, nobody was willing to enter yet another one, a sort of national unity government between Conservatives and Labour Party. So everybody was really excited for a Jamaica coalition. Now, you might be aware of this. Germans love giving these weird nicknames to our coalitions. The Jamaica coalition. So the Jamaican flag is a black, green, and yellow, sort of a yellow cross on a black and green background. Those are very much the party colors of the Conservatives. The greens and the yellow is the Liberal Party. So that's a Jamaica coalition, and it looked like in 2017 that we would end up with a Jamaica coalition. At that time, obviously, the press loves these nicknames. There were so many horrendous titles, right? They're all lying on the beach on Jamaica. Who did smoke what on Jamaica? That was that sort of wordplay. But that coalition, last time in 2017, those negotiations failed. And why the Liberal Party very much left those negotiations, again, as I said this time, the Liberal Party is sort of presenting itself as a very progressive party in the sense that it wants to bring a new wind, a fresh wind into politics, into stale German politics, and they felt underrepresented in the last government, headed still by Angela Merkel, and they left with the sentence, famous sentence by the party leader Christian Lindner, which was, "It's better not to govern than to govern in a bad way, than to govern wrongly." And they just left. They stood up, left after months and months of coalition talks, and then that whole process had to begin anew. And we're sort of frightened that might happen again this time, right? And we didn't have a government until the next year. So that's kind of the two extremes, a 30-day affair to, well, eternity, basically.
Just going to ask, what possible coalitions are we looking at now? So I've heard of a traffic light coalition. Do you think that's the most... is that the option where the maths makes the most sense, where you can avoid a grand coalition?
The two coalitions that were in this discussion after this election result, there were actually two rivaling ones. Again, the Jamaica coalition, headed by the Conservatives, black, green, and Liberal, yellow, versus the winning Labour Party, leading that coalition together with the Greens and the Liberals, so red, green, and yellow, or red, yellow, and green, funnily nicknamed the Streetlight Coalition, the Apple Coalition. Again, the headlines basically write themselves. And that's been the prevailing argument in the press in those last couple of days. Now, the interesting thing between those two coalition options, between Streetlight or Traffic Light and Jamaica, is both of them include the Greens and the Liberals. Again, those former minor players, now a bit bigger players that were voted for by sort of the young people. And that's been the dominant point of discussion. Wow, the young people can really make a difference this time because the Greens and the Liberals can basically choose who they're going to make chancellor, right? They are sort of the joint kingmakers, as we alluded to previously. They can really choose if they want to make Olaf Scholz the chancellor or Armin Laschet.
So presumably at this point, this becomes a bit like... We saw this in miniature when we had our coalition government, where we saw, that there were talks. So the Lib Dems were kind of the kingmakers then. They could have gone with Labour, they could have gone with the Conservatives, and there was kind of a bit of back and forth about who they'd go with and so on. And so is, at this point, is it the Greens and FDP playing CDU, CSU and SPD off each other? Or is it more, how much does the public get a sense of kind of what's going on behind closed doors, I guess?
Yeah, well, not as much as 2017. Again, we're scarred from that. In 2017, we got sort of minute-by-minute coverage. Every politician involved was heading to Twitter and letting the whole public know what's going on. That was very much a reason why those discussions, those negotiations blew up in 2017. So this time around, all the parties involved are very much sworn to secrecy. That's another big point. So the Liberal and the Green Party know, obviously, about their tremendous gain in power this time around. So they're really basking in it right now. Usually the procedure would be that the winning candidate, so either the Labour Party or the Conservatives, invite the party bosses of the smaller parties to, talk with them and negotiate, because the big parties are usually in a pole position. This time around, almost shockingly, the Green and the Liberal candidates and the party leaders came out to the press and said, no, this time around, the small parties are going to negotiate between themselves, and then afterwards we're going to see and have a look who we're going to join. Now, as I mentioned previously, just today we got wind that the Conservative Party is, Laschet is possibly stepping down at some point. So the Conservative Party has basically been in shambles since the election. There's a lot of infighting about the future path of the party, the consequences of this election, to explain this tremendous loss for them. So the Conservatives have sort of taken themselves out of the picture, possibly because they don't like to be the ball of the play ball of the smaller parties, right? They're very consciously, we are not just your second best choice. And now everything seems to be, as of today and maybe yesterday, that the first real possibility is going to be the traffic light coalition between the Labour Party, the Green Party, and the Liberals. Right? That's what we're looking at right now. That's sort of becoming ever more clear. Now, to international listeners, that might sound like a done deal, right? Labour, Liberal, Green, that all sounds decently progressive. They might get along. But as I said in the very beginning, we have two camps. The Labour Party and the Greens, they get along fine. That's done deal. The Liberals, on the other hand, remember, are a centre-right party. There's a lot of difference, especially between the Greens and the Liberals, which is why maybe it was good that they met up first. And suddenly the Liberals and the Labour Party. The Liberals promised that they would not raise taxes, whereas the Labour Party and the Greens are sort of traditionally left-wing, and that they want to take away a bit from the richest in society and give it to the poor, that whole old Robin Hood tale, whereas the Liberal Party is very much protective of what you've earned and much more conservative in their financial business. So that's going to be a difficult bridge to build between them. Now, obviously, there are a lot of values that they share. It's often said that there's going to be no problem at all in social policy. So we're looking at a very socially progressive, probably coalition if it all works out. Again, it might not. We might end up with Jamaica if the Liberals or somebody else is walking out again, like in 2017. No problem at all in social policy. So all three, for example, like gay and trans rights are probably not going to be an issue, whereas there were with the Conservatives in the last government. So the right for self-determination for trans people might see some progress in there, because the Greens and Liberals were very much progressive on that, whereas the Labour Party was sort of mixed. They might work towards a more harmonious balance between family and career, sort of uniting that. If we were to take the conservative view, we would say that's probably the degradation of family values or whatever. But yeah, very socially progressive. And the Liberals and the Greens, in a crowd-pleasing manner, they already claimed, the legalization of marijuana, that's going to be top of our list, and we're going to convince the Labour Party of that, right? So that's where we won't see any problems, the sort of social policy. The real problems we're going to meet on financial and economic topics, and that's where I'm going to run out of vocabulary very quickly. That's not where I'm very strong, sort of economic policy in English, but trying it. So one of the key promises of the Labour Chancellor candidate of Olaf Scholz was to raise the minimum wage to 12 euros. That was plastered everywhere on big red posters, Olaf Scholz in black and white saying in big letters, €12 for this and this many million people, which is an easy deal with the Greens, but maybe not so much with the Liberal Party. So we're going to see about that. There was a discussion around sort of the balanced budget amendment in the Constitution. So, again, vocabulary that sort of forbids the federal government to run a deficit, a structural deficit to a certain degree. And the Labour Party and the Greens were sort of trying to loosen that a bit, and we can definitely run a little more of a deficit than is allowed by the Constitution, whereas the Liberals said, no, definitely not. So you kind of see those two philosophies are at odds, as are sort of, I said that the social philosophies really do align, and policy-wise that's true, but the Greens and the Liberals, sometimes their voter base couldn't be more different in that. So if the Greens are very much willing to let the state fix things. I previously said that there's this, that they are sort of the alleged party of prohibition and all, of sort of big state involvement, whereas the Liberals are very much clearly not. And that sort of reflects in their voter base, right? The Greens are, if we buy into stereotypes, are sort of more hip. Everything has to be eco-friendly and regulated party, whereas the Liberal Party is very much, let it rip. We're all free. Individual freedom is on the top of our agenda. So it's definitely not a smooth transition towards an agreement between those three parties. So the Trevor-like coalition is probably going to come into effect, but we'll see.
Can I ask a quick question? So in UK politics, brief flirtation with coalition, one of the big impacts of that was that, the Lib Dems had to give up some of their key policy proposals in order to get power, one of which was student tuition fees, which they had to abandon. And that meant in the next election, they were punished heavily by former Lib Dem voters who felt that they'd been betrayed by the party, essentially. They'd given up one of their core principles in order to secure power. Does the same happen in German politics? So like you said about that promise for, a minimum wage of €12, if that is one of the policies that has to fall by the wayside in a coalition deal, will voters punish them at the next election? Or is that just seen as, we always have coalitions, this is part of deal making, get over it and move on? I think that's my question, yeah.
It's very much the latter. Good that you're asking this, because I totally forgot about that difference. That's a key difference probably between our two countries, because people are so used to coalitions. So if you're talking to a Liberal or Green Party or Labour voter these days, and ask them, okay, what do you hope, which promises are they going to keep after the election? Their answer is probably going to be, this and that, but, compromise has to be struck, and we're going to see, we're going to try to get our policy across, but compromise is always part of the deal. So that's, in a way, our system is very conciliatory in that way, right? It's very much, we're used to sort of the lowest denominator politics.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, no, that's very interesting. Thank you.
As I said, the ones that sort of have to jump ship and join the other side are the Liberals. They are sort of trying to re-establish themselves as a more centrist party that's open to both sides of politics. So it's going to be, I think what we're looking at here, to kind of summarize all that, is a realignment of party politics, of our party system. Again, the two big parties aren't all that big anymore. We had a viable third party candidate for chancellery in Annalena Baerbock, the Green Party candidate. Of course, that didn't amount to anything, but it was a real possibility. If the election were to have been held in May of this year, we probably would have a Green-led government. Similarly, if it was before that the Conservatives, of course, but there was a Green moment. And the other thing is the minor parties are now very much decisive in shaping the next government. They're probably going to have a lot more ministries. Maybe I need to explain that as well. So the ministries are also divided between all of them. So I can't even tell you what sort of policies the next government is going to enact, because we don't know. There's a huge difference between, say, a Green Minister of Agriculture and a Liberal one, right? As you can imagine. So that's another big thing. Like the smaller parties are very much, they are in the position of power this time. And just today, actually, the three parties met for the first time And I haven't yet watched their press conference, but I imagine they are all very optimistic about the future. So we're going to see. I think, if I had to say who's going to be in power next year, it's probably Olaf Scholz as new chancellor, with the Greens and the Liberals running a sort of progressive center-to-center-left government, which is going to be a change from the sort of conservative and Labour-led years of Angela Merkel. We'll see how that's going to change.
Rob, did you have anything else to ask before we kind of wrap up?
No, I think that's very good. I just think it's very nice that you finally got somebody on this podcast who knows when they're rambling rather than me who can just ramble on and on.
I know we introduced you earlier, and it's great to have someone on who knows much more about the topic than we do, because I think that's been very informative. There's a lot on the cutting room floor because it was great, and we talked for a long time. So this will be slightly shorter than the recording we've had, but it's been very interesting. I'm not complaining. It is great, and thank you very much for joining us and telling us about this.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was so much fun. I've never been in a podcast. I've never spoken about this kind of thing, especially not in English. So this was really exciting for me. Thanks for letting me ramble.
That's fine. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
A lot of fun. And I hope the listeners kind of understood where we were coming from. Obviously, this election result wasn't as clean cut as this party won and blah, blah, blah. So this was kind of difficult.
But I mean, I hope that's why it will be an interesting thing for our listeners. In the same way it's interesting for us. Like, it's a different system. And, you know, there are only so many like potted BBC summaries of how things work that people can read. It's sometimes nice just to have kind of a more in-depth talk about it. So as always, thank you to all our listeners. If you want to follow the podcast, you can do so in all of the usual places. That's on Facebook as Unparliamentary Language. That's on Reddit at /r/unparliamentary. On Twitter and Instagram at Unparl Podcast. And of course, if you like what we're doing and want to support us, support the running of the website, the cost of equipment and editing software, then you can go to patreon.com/TTSS, where you can throw $1 or $2 our way in order to get bonus content. For this episode, we had a bit of a chat with Lucas beforehand about YouTube stuff. If that interests you, come along and listen to that. There's always a bonus episode. It also supports all the other shows on the network as well. So please do that. And I think there's nothing left for me to say other than it's good night from me.
And it's good night from him. Bye.
Und gute Nacht aus Deutschland. Ciao. Bye-bye.
Bye. Ciao.
Bye.
Ciao is good. I wasn't expecting
good.
ciao. That's great.
Oh, we're totally saying
Okay,
ciao. We stole that from the Italians. Ciao, ciao.
Join Mike and Tom for nerdy conversation with a multitude of guests on Hat of Many Things.
Say hi, guys.
Hi, guys.
Hello.
I'm Mark, a librarian and professional wrestling ring announcer.
I cast League of Legends.
Soteros Philbrucato, best known for my work with White Wolf and Onyx Path Publishing on the World of Darkness.
Hi, I'm Jason Carl. I'm the producer of V5 at White Wolf.
Yeah, my name is Johanna Pettersson. I'm a Finnish game designer.